This question is interesting only because it shows the further step that comes with this touch, with this realization of one's being in Christ or one's life in God. It says, "You never seem pressed for time or pressed upon by the outer. Has this come through grace gradually, or did it come as a revelation through the practice of the present?" It came gradually, and it came not by seeking that, not even by knowing that such things are possible to us on this plane of existence, but it came about through study, search for God. My own search had to do primarily with filling a void in my life, an emptiness inside that was never satisfied. And although it had much gratification on the outer plane, it had no inner satisfaction. And that was what drove me originally to the study of Christian Science. And then through that beginning, I was led to all of these different phases of spiritual revelation of all people throughout all time, in all nations. And just by studying gradually, reading inspirational writings and practicing the truth as we learn them in these truth teachings, there developed a capacity for just doing one thing at a time until a day came when a problem of supply made me tear up all of the outstanding bills that I had as a practitioner and begin to realize that my supply was not dependent on patients, not dependent on students, but on the presence and power of God. And so from that day, I had no more accounts receivable. I had no more books. The only books I had was a diary where I kept appointments, and then income, which was entered as it came in and then only for income tax purposes, because it didn't bother me how much came in as long as the bills were paid. But as you know, we have to keep a record of income for the government. But I had no other record, no outstandings, and I developed through that the realization that I do not live on yesterday's manna. I live only on the manna as it falls today, and so my dependence was what came in today, not anything that was due from yesterday or carried over from last month. And that brought about a state of consciousness of todayness or nowness, so that I never felt responsible for anything but this day and this moment. And that led to another thing. When a call came for help, I felt under the obligation of meeting that call now, not giving it a treatment tonight before I went to bed, not going out to the movies and then coming back and do the work, not even going to church and coming back and doing the work, but when the call came, do it now. And so when the mail came, I developed the habit of answering it on the same day that it came in, and sometimes that entailed staying up at night. But all was coming to the next morning with a clear desk. Well, you will be surprised that if you were to take care of everything as it came up, when it came up, how much spare time you'd have in the day. Most of the time, we haven't got free days because of the accumulations that have come about from yesterday's and the day before's, and we're always making up for it. But now, that has carried over into my present experience, so that if I am here and somebody says, have you got a minute to talk to me, I certainly have, because that's all I've got to do this minute. I have no other obligation this minute than to fulfill any demand that's made upon me. Now, when I go back to the hotel, I have mail. And if it requires sitting up at night to do it, it will be done. But as those of you who have written me know, you get a prompt reply. That is the reason nothing accumulates. Now, through that practice, this consciousness develops of never being pressed from outside, because there's nothing to do except what is at hand this minute. And with that comes this other idea of never being pressed for supply, never being pressed for any obligation tomorrow, because there is only today, and there is only this hour of today, there is only this moment of today. And then it develops, you don't do it, it develops in you a sense of peace, a sense of quiet, and you begin to understand how the Master could say, I of my own self can do nothing. It's the Father within me that doeth the work. And there develops through that, and of course Paul's statement, I can do all things through Christ, or I live, yet not I, Christ liveth. There develops a state of consciousness which I have called the not I. Or that isn't an original term with me, I read it somewhere. But I use that term, not I. In other words, there are no demands ever upon me. So I have nothing to do with the outside world. Every demand that is made upon me is made upon the Christ. I learned years and years ago that nobody is very much interested in Joel. And very few people have ever had much time for Joel. But the Father within me is of interest to everybody, because the Father within me can be of service, can be of help, can be of illumination. And so, when people come to me, I feel no personal call. I feel no personal demand on me, but on the Father within me. And you'll be surprised how much work the Father can do in 12 seconds. Much more than you or I could do in 12 hours. And as you realize, even when a financial demand is made upon you, that it isn't upon you, it isn't upon me, it's upon the Christ. The demand doesn't disturb you. That when you're called upon for help, it doesn't make any difference if it's one patient or 100. It can't disturb me. The demand isn't made upon me. It's made upon the Christ. And I know how well the Christ can take care of every demand that's made upon me. And so I can say with Paul, at least in a measure, I live, yet not I. It's the Christ living in me, and it is performing whatever work has to be done, whether it's healing work, teaching work, financing work, whatever it is to be done. It's not a call on me. It can't disturb me. It cannot intrude upon me, because it is the Father within that has to meet it. You will gain an awareness of what I mean if you can agree that this life is God in action. If this life is God in action, then what have you got to do with being responsible or being hurt or being praised? You will never be moved by praise if you ever realize that this is an activity of the Christ, not of man. And you will never be hurt by censure if you know that this is an activity of the Christ and not of man. Because anything that anyone is praising is the Christ, not the person. And what do you think they'd be condemning? The Christ and not the person. If they misunderstand the Christ, they will condemn it. But they're not condemning me. No one has any reason to condemn me. I haven't done anything. Therefore, only the Christ. And the Christ can take the condemnation and dissolve it. It knows how to handle it. It knows just how to handle it with love and with grace. I don't. I'm apt to get very, very mad at some of the things that go on in the world, but it doesn't. And so I've learned to let it take care of it, and that handles my anger and resentment. And so it is. Once you can see that your life is not yours, please mark this. Your life isn't yours. Your life is God's. Know ye not that you're God's? You belong to God. God is responsible for your demonstration, not you. And so whatever of good takes place in your life is God in action. Whatever of evil takes place in your life is only in proportion as you put the word I in there. I. Develop the habit of not I. No praise for me, no condemnation for me, and no responsibility. Let yourself be called upon for anything in this world. Anything. Without resentment, without rebellion, without feeling that it's too much, by virtue of the fact that the Christ of you is going to fulfill it. If the Christ doesn't, it isn't going to be fulfilled, and even then it wouldn't be your responsibility. And so as you give up personal responsibility, as you give up even any pleasure in praise, and realize that isn't praise for me. I know better than that. This wouldn't have been done but for the presence of God or the activity of the Christ. And let that Christ take the praise. And then when you're censured, let that Christ take the censure. It will know how to handle it. But when responsibility comes, be sure that you don't put the I in there and say, how am I going to do this? How am I going to perform that? How can I accomplish this? My health isn't up to it. My strength isn't up to it. My bank account isn't up to it. Well, I can imagine Jesus saying the same thing when there were 5,000 people waiting to be fed. I don't have storehouses or barns. Only he did not let the word I intrude there. He acknowledged that I of my own self can do nothing. But it is said that he looked up to heaven. In other words, his expectation was, thy grace is sufficient for this occasion. And so he let thy grace perform the feat of multiplying loaves and fishes. I doubt that he would try to multiply loaves and fishes. I'm sure he wouldn't. But he would let the grace of God appear through him as the multiplication of loaves and fishes. And so as we learn, and of course it's probably easier if you're a practitioner to learn this than in the business world. Nobody but a practitioner knows how impossible it is to heal anybody of anything. Only a practitioner knows that it's the activity of the Christ. And without the activity of the Christ, the practitioner would be lost. And so it becomes an easy thing for a practitioner to learn that I of my own self can do nothing, that the Father within me doeth the works, and then abide in that. It is true that it is the activity of the Christ in the practitioner's consciousness that brings this about. That's true. And so the practitioner has a responsibility. And the practitioner's responsibility is to live and move and have his being in Christ. The practitioner's responsibility is to live in the secret place of the Most High, and in that way allow the activity of the Christ to function. And of course the way it is done is just that. As we study, as we read, as we listen, as we have lessons, all of this is developing our consciousness. It's not adding to our knowledge, not adding to our human wisdom. It is developing our consciousness. And the consciousness that is being developed is a faith, or more than faith. It's an understanding and an experience of God presence. Now, the moment a person has an experience of God presence, they are no longer living their lives. It is God living their lives for them. It is the Christ living its life for them or through them. And so the individual has nothing to do but to be very peaceful and quiet and let it all happen. I have said in past classes that it is like living, looking over your shoulder all the time. You're always watching God unfold. You're always watching the presence of the Christ come through in the infinite way. I have said, be a beholder. Now, you know, the responsibility's all out of life once you become a beholder, because your entire attitude is, well, this is Saturday night, and I have nothing to do tonight but rest. And then wake up tomorrow and behold what the Father will set before me to do. And so you begin with early in the morning in a sense of expectancy of what the Father will present for us to do. But then once the Father presents it, there comes a smile with the remembrance, yes, but he that gave it to me, he also performeth it. And then, of course, you have the joy of watching how the Father performed that which the Father gave you to do. And so all of life becomes being a beholder and watching it unfold. Well, while you're doing that, you've caught the vision of that booklet, Love and Gratitude. Now, I have said this before, I probably will say it again, that I debated a long time whether to put the price on it of $50 a copy or 50 cents a copy, and I was tempted to mark it $50 a copy. I was afraid that with 50 cents nobody would believe that the secret of life was in it. But actually it is. It is. That little booklet's got a secret of life that anyone can find their way into heaven with. And I thought, well, no one's going to believe that they're going to get all of the kingdom of heaven for 50 cents. Perhaps if I charge them $50, they'll really believe it and look for it. But then as I thought it over, the thought came, no, that is using a human means to attract their mind to a spiritual thing, and it won't work. So we'll just make it 50 cents and turn it loose and let everybody concern themselves with whether they find the secret in that book. Now, and there it is. Very clearly and very definitely that booklet reveals that only in proportion as we understand that God is love can we come into the harmony of our existence. Because then we give up the idea that we can be loving or that somebody else can be loving. And we give up the belief that somebody can give love or withhold love. Because no longer do we look to anyone for love, and no longer do we believe that we have the capacity to be loving or to give love. And we understand love to be a quality and an activity of God. Well, you see, from that moment on, it is a very simple thing not to be pressed by outer conditions, because you no longer have any worries or any fears. You never can doubt that since God is love, that love will flow. Our only disappointments in life have been when we look to man whose breath is in his nostril for love, or gratitude, or reward, or compensation, or recognition. Oh, once in a while it comes, but you know that not as a general rule. Most of us at some time or other suffer frustration because of the very things we're doing that nobody's recognizing. Nobody's rewarding us for, nobody's acknowledging, and nobody's compensating us for. And of course that will go on forever. As long as we look to the disciples, even our own disciples, they go to sleep on us. In the moment when we need them most, they'll go to sleep. And maybe the pet ones like Peter will even deny us. Those are the experiences that happen to everybody who looks to man whose breath is in his nostril for any form of good. But when you have trained yourself to the realization that only God is love, only God can bestow love, and God has no capacity to withhold it. That's one thing even God can't do, is withhold love. Not any more than sunshine can withhold warmth or light. The sun hasn't that power, and God has no power to withhold love. We remove ourselves from love's embrace by looking to man for love. And it isn't there. Love is of God. And everyone that takes that simple rule into their lives and practices it and continues to abide in the realization that my expectancy is of God. Thy grace is sufficient for me. Not my mother's or father's or sisters or brothers, not my children's or my neighbor's. Thy grace is sufficient for me. And abide in that, you'll soon see how free you will be of any pressure from the outside world. You will be very much in the position of the Master who could feed the multitude, but never look to anybody to feed him. He could heal the multitude, but when he needed a little treatment, he couldn't find anyone to stay awake with him. Well, he proved he didn't need them. He made the demonstration all by himself. The hard way, oh yes, would have been much easier if those disciples had been able to stay awake and give him the support he needed. He probably would have gone through the experience with less severity within himself. But that didn't matter. He made the demonstration. He was resurrected. He came forth from the tomb. So his resurrection, his demonstration was made even without the disciples, but only for one reason. He so well knew that the Father within me doeth the work. He so well knew that even Pilate, with all his temporal power, wasn't a real power, didn't have a real power. The only real power was the Father within. Thou couldst have no power over me unless it comes from the Father in heaven. And so, and study the life of the Master, and watch how his whole life was lived in the realization that the Father doeth this. He that is within me is greater than he that is in the world. The Father within me doeth these things, not I. And study Paul, not so much for the errors of his mission or teaching, but for those things which were correct. And he was absolutely correct in that part of his teaching where he revealed, I can do all things through Christ, or I live, yet not I, Christ liveth in me. And in that realization, once you've seen that Christ meets every demand, whether it's for healing, feeding, supplying, forgiving, that's another thing. We don't have to forgive. We're never called on to forgive. Really and truly we're not. Forgiveness is of God. Forgiveness is of God. And once we realize that, forgiveness flows through us. But it's of God. It's like love. See, forgiveness is just another quality of love. And so, as we understand that only God can love, we know right well that only God can forgive. And that gives us that not I again. You see, I don't have to forgive. I don't have to be hurt. I don't have to be rebellious. I don't have to resist or resent. It has nothing to me. God is love, and God's going to do all the loving. God's going to do all the adjusting and all the forgiving and all the feeding and all the healing. And so I just become a beholder of God appearing through me and through you. I become a beholder of God appearing as me and as you, as the activity of my being and as the activity of your being. And so you'll notice this whole week I have brought to your attention that great fact that they're not people out here. It's God. God appearing in infinite form and variety. And what we behold as men and women, that just represents our finite concept of God. It's our false sense of God. Actually, all there is here is God manifested as the Son, because the Father and the Son is one. God and the child is one. God the invisible, the Son, the child, visible. And so, once you see that, you find the ability to live as a beholder of God appearing in this world. A beholder of God performing that which is given me to do. The beholding of God as the divine law of adjustment. And you'll be surprised whether you bring this into family relationships or community relationships or capital and labor relationships, that the law works out the same the moment you no longer take sides and let God appear in the midst of all and realize thy grace. When you look to a man for a decision, you may get a good one or a bad one, a correct one or an incorrect one. That can't happen if you are not looking to the man but looking to God for the answer. And so all of this again is a revelation of our self-completeness in God. We are complete not by virtue of our own being, but by virtue of the fact that God is our being. And God has the responsibility for our being. God has the responsibility for our immortality, for our eternality. You know something? God has the responsibility for seeing that justice and recognition and reward come into our experience. That isn't my responsibility, and it isn't yours. It isn't my responsibility to be grateful to you, and it isn't your responsibility to be grateful to me. It's God's responsibility to see that we're grateful to each other, that we cooperate with each other. Why? Because all these things are love, and love is of God, not of man. Man is only the vehicle for its expression. Man is only the avenue or instrument for God's life to be expressed, God's love to be expressed, God's wisdom to be expressed. We could all have worries by thinking that we didn't have enough wisdom or experience to fulfill our job. We could all have worries by thinking we didn't have enough understanding to heal the case. That's all dispelled the moment you know that it isn't your wisdom or your understanding or mine, but God's. God's wisdom, God's understanding, God's justice, God's mercy, God's benevolence that governs all of us. And there you have it. It's all a question of whether you are still dealing with the word I. I, me, mine. My wisdom, my strength, my understanding, or your wisdom, your strength, your understanding, or your appreciation or your gratitude, or whether you have turned from that and said, I'm not concerned with whether anybody is grateful or whether anybody is loving or anybody is fair or anybody is just. I renounce all that. I look for my love, justice, recognition, reward, acknowledgement, compensation in and of God. And the moment you take that attitude, you are freed, just as it comments there. You are freed from the world. You are freed from the world. But you'll be in bondage to the world as long as you look to it for that which actually must come to you from God and only from God. It's a mistake. I don't know how it began, but I'm sure that it began with the word I. I owe you this, and you owe me that. I ought to do this, and you ought to do that, instead of realizing only God can do. Only God can do. Only God can perform. Only God can love. Only God can think. Only God can give wisdom. Only God is the healing agency, the feeding, the supplying agency. Only God. I can do all things through God. I can do all things through God. Without God, I'm nothing. My doctrine is not mine, but his that sent me. If I speak of myself, I bear witness to a lie. Even the great master, Christ Jesus, said that. What then of us, if we should say I? Or if we should sin further by saying, you owe me this, or you should do this, or you ought to do this, where the whole teaching is only God can do this. Only God can express love. Only God can express wisdom. Only God can express joy. We're just a vehicle through which that appears. Is that clear? It should be. It must eventually be that we must give up the personal sense of selfhood, that we must give up personal responsibility and let this presence take over. It will do it. Everyone who has ever had a healing has had the results of this, because whoever brought about the healing only brought it about in proportion to their capacity to receive the God impulse. That's all. Not by virtue of any personal wisdom or personal spirituality or personal goodness, no. But by being a vehicle, an instrument through which God could function. And now so it is in every phase of our life. If we will realize this minute, we have to start with this minute because you can't start this tomorrow. You can't even start this after you get home. Everything that happens must happen now and in this moment. And we can begin now to realize that only God functions through my being, and I look only to God to function through anyone's being to me. I loose everybody in my experience and let them go, and look only to God for whatever it is that heretofore I have been expecting from man. Now that's the secret. That's the secret of life. That's the secret of the first commandment. Only God is power. Worship only God. Don't look to any man whose breath is in his nostril. We're told by Isaiah, cease ye from man whose breath is in his nostril, for wherein is he to be accounted of? And we're told by the psalmist, put not your faith in princes. Now all these things should teach us that it is God's good pleasure to give us the kingdom. Why then should we seek it from man? It is God's good pleasure to give us the kingdom. Why should we seek it from man? Why should we look to man for that which it is God's good pleasure to give us? Why not go direct? Always direct. Again, I give it to you. It seems to be a theme this week, rushing through me, and it keeps repeating itself. I am come that ye might be fulfilled. I am come that ye might be fulfilled. Now, why then do you look to your parents or your children or your neighbors if all the time you're carrying around within you I in the midst of you? He that is within you is greater than he that is in the world. I, the Father within you, is your sufficiency. Now, is there any longer an excuse for us to keep on looking to Washington, D.C., to a new administration for our safety and security and prosperity? Is there any use to look to a United Nations or a League of Nations or a combination of men for our good when all the time my grace is sufficient for you? Thy grace, God's grace, is sufficient for you. What then do you need to look to men or the organization of men for your grace, your safety, or your security, or your peace? Why look out into the world for peace and wonder when we're going to have world peace? In the world, they're never going to have world peace. It's always going to be just a temporary condition until the kingdom of God comes on earth. But the kingdom of God doesn't come on earth except to you and to me, to individual beings. It doesn't come as a blanket thing, because it cannot come to the world at large. Why do you think that is? Because there is a law that as ye sow, so shall ye reap. And as long as there are people out in the world cheating, lying, defrauding, as long as there are nations preying on other nations, as long as there are people preying on other races and colors and creeds, how can they have peace? That would be a violation of everything the Master came to teach us. There can be no peace for a nation that is preying on another nation or that is preying on certain races and colors of its own nation. That cannot be. That would be a defiance of all the God laws of love thy neighbor as thyself and pray for your enemy. Well, you might just as well tear up the teaching of Jesus as ever to expect peace on earth until the people of the earth are living, love thy neighbor. Now, fortunately, and I give you as authority the 91st Psalm, our safety and our security and our peace and our health and prosperity is not dependent on whether or not the world ever has peace or prosperity. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000, it shall not come nigh you. Who? You, who live in the secret place of the Most High. The moment you live this life of the Spirit, which is a sufficiency through Christ, a demonstration through God, the moment you live that life, none of the things that afflict the world will afflict you. It may have a depression, but you won't have. It may have a war, but it will not come nigh thy dwelling place. And so, it isn't necessary for us to sit around waiting for the rest of the world to have peace. As long as there are men cheating, chiseling, as long as there are men believing that they can live at somebody else's expense, get something for nothing, those people will suffer from that very belief. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. If you live by the sword, you will die by the sword. Try to get away from the Master's teaching and see how far you will get. And it wasn't only because Christ Jesus gave it, it was given before. It is only that he gave it because it was a revealed truth. I came not to destroy the prophets, but to fulfill them. These things have been taught before Jesus Christ. He merely came to repeat them, to fulfill them, and to show you the demonstration of them. But the very moment that you go in opposition to them, the moment you violate the law of love, loving your neighbor as yourself, praying for your enemy, you are coming under the condemnation of spiritual law. But bring yourself into oneness with spiritual law. Bring yourself into the realization that I do not expect of man, but only of God. I look wholly, completely, eternally to the Father within me for my good. I am come. I look to that I of my own being to fulfill my experience. I turn every responsibility over to the Christ of my being as you live in that life, and free everybody else from the bondage of criticism, condemnation, judgment. The whole world can collapse, but not where you are standing. It will not come nigh your dwelling place. You are freed from the world, from the things of the world, and from the people of the world. The very moment that you loose the world and let it go, loose man whose breath is in his nostril, he will never bother you again. People resent us, and people fight us and resist us only in proportion as we have some hold on them, in proportion as we are looking to them for something. Do they want to tear away from that bondage and have their freedom? But the moment we give them their freedom and say, you owe me nothing, you owe me nothing, my good is of God, so let us live together, joy together, share together, but you owe me nothing, my good is of God. That moment you have freed yourself from all of the hates, envies, jealousies of the world, and you live your conscious union with God. Now that's the secret. It's the secret of spiritual living. It is the secret of the mystical life. I and the Father are one, and all that the Father hath is mine. Has that got anything to do with anybody else in the world, or being owed something by somebody just by right of marriage or might of parenthood or child? No. No, very definitely, none of these things move me once my reliance is on God. Why? You know you can't ever be disappointed. You ever stop to realize that God has never yet failed anyone? I've never seen the righteous begging bread. Oh, a lot of people say, oh, I have. Oh, I know someone who's going to church every day of their lives and were very poor. That doesn't make them righteous. The righteous man is the one who is living in obedience to spiritual law, not the one who goes to church regularly. The one who is living in obedience to the spiritual law of love thy neighbor as thyself, pray for thy enemies, forgive 70 times 7, hold nobody in bondage to you, and look only to the Christ for your all-sufficiency. And I can assure you that that's righteousness. And the person who is living that life will never beg bread. The Father will never let him down. Elijah was fed by ravens bringing him food. a poor widow sharing, finding cakes baked on the stones. Moses found manna falling in the desert, water in the rocks, the Red Sea opening for him, cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. And I don't have to tell you what Jesus found. Gold in the fish's mouth, loaves and fishes multiplied. The righteous are never begging bread. Only what constitutes righteousness? Conscious union with God. The realization of God as Father, creative principle. The realization of God as support and supply. The realization of God as the health of my countenance. The realization that my sufficiency is of God. The realization of the fact that only God can love, and therefore I must not look to man for love, but I must let love flow through me to man, and then not claim any praise for it or any reward for it, because it wasn't of me, it was of God. I wouldn't be surprised that that is it.
Good morning. This is Joel in Waikiki. I have been listening to this recording, and I caught a wonderful inspiration from a part of it, strangely enough, a small part, but I noticed that I quoted, "Those that live by the sword will die by the sword." And as I heard that quotation, the inner significance of it, the deeper meaning of it, registered with me. To use the sword means to use power. We usually think of it as meaning that if we use temporal power, if we use physical force, or even mental might. That's the point that I want to bring out to you. Previously, in our metaphysical work, we thought that it was perfectly right to use mental power. We agreed that it wasn't so good to use physical means, but mental powers, that was something different. And yet all the time we've known that the mental realm and the physical realm were one and the same thing, just two different aspects of the same thing. Through the infinite way, we have been lifted to the understanding of spirit, to the spiritual realm, to the spiritual kingdom, in which there is no might and no power, just my spirit. You will catch the meaning of this if only you can understand that God is not a power. God just is. God is being. God is love. God is life. And in approaching any problem, in approaching any manner of discord, let us see how close we can come to resisting the temptation to use power, even the power of thought. even what is called the power of truth. In other words, in the realization of God, is there a presence or a power to be overcome against which some other power must be used? Is not the very nature of the infinite way the revelation of God as one? It really isn't a simple thing to put into words the nature of God as love, the nature of God as being, but surely you, with your inner awareness aroused, you who are awakened to some measure of the feel of God, surely you can understand that since God is not a power to be used, God is not a power to exercise, that somewhere there must come to the children of God a period of rest, a Sabbath, a refraining from not only the use of the sword, a refraining from the use of power in any form. We are on very high ground when we acknowledge God as love. We are on very high ground when we acknowledge God as spirit, as life. And then let that acknowledgement do all for us that needs doing. Just think. Let the acknowledgement of God, let the atmosphere of God do all things for us that needs doing. At this point, there is a complete rest, a complete stillness, a complete silence. Soon you will be reading about this deep well of contentment, this deep silence into which we relax, and through which all good appears to us. If I have made clear in even one tiny measure that we are to seek the atmosphere of God's presence and rest, that we are to seek the consciousness of His presence and rest, that we are to adopt for ourselves the great consciousness of, in quietness and in confidence, finding our strength. If I am able to make clear, even in a tiny measure, that He leadeth us beside the still waters, in green pastures, that we may rest from strife, from struggle, from effort, and let the divine wonders appear to us, then I will be happy. Then I will feel that I have been able to show you the inner meaning of the teaching of the infinite way. Then I will feel that I've been able to lead you into the inner sanctuary where the noise of the world never reaches, where the troubles of the world never penetrate. And where is this? In the very deep of your own consciousness, in the very deep of your own soul, when you have refrained from strife, from struggle, from taking thought. And so again, aloha, aloha, this is Joel.